Please give a warm welcome to Alan Adler.
Thank you all for coming today. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the history of the AeroPress, and then brew some coffee for you right up here. And we have a coffee brewing lab, as you know, where you can come in and brew some yourself. The next lab will be in a few hours, and it's around the corner to the right, back there. How many of you presently brew with the AeroPress? So that's nearly everybody, huh? Okay, well, this is a picture a friend took of my working on my lathe, and this is the lathe that I made the many AeroPresses on. Our company started with this, which is the Aerobee Flying Ring, in 1984. I was an electronics engineer and had, as a hobby, studied aerodynamics because I loved sailing and I wanted to design sailboats. And I licensed some flying toys that I applied my newly acquired knowledge of aerodynamics towards. But usually my licensed designs only stayed on the market for a couple of years, and when I developed the Aerobee Flying Ring, which was my best design ever, my good wife suggested maybe we should start a little business and make and sell it. And we did. And that business is about 30 years old today. And the Aerobee Flying Ring, for nearly all of those 30 years, was our best-selling product. But now it's had to take second place behind the AeroPress coffee maker. So this is Aaron Hemmings in Mendocino, California. He set the current world record with the Aerobee. He threw it 1,333 feet, which is 13 feet beyond a quarter mile. And the Aerobee actually lodged in a bush about this tall. If not for that bush, I think it would have been about 1,350 feet. Now, this may seem really silly to show you a picture of our Christmas party, but there's a method to my madness. This woman right here in the red sweater is Pam Abbott, wife of our sales manager, Donald Abbott. This, by the way, is my wife up here who helps in the business. Pam and I were having a conversation one day, and we were commiserating about how difficult it was to make one serving of coffee in an automatic drip machine. And I sort of got interested in the challenge of that, and the next day found me experimenting with pour-overs, which I did in my kitchen for a month. And it was during that time that I decided that 175-degree water made the best tasting pour-over. But I was frustrated by the fact that the drip process took about 4 or 5 minutes. I tried to speed it up because I thought if I shortened the process, the coffee would be less bitter. I tried pressing on the slurry of coffee with a spoon, and really nothing happened. So I got the idea of making a closed chamber. This is a sketch that I drew in my engineering notebook in 2004. And it's not terribly different from the present AeroPress. There's a cup, there's a cap with holes in it, a chamber with a flange to sit on the cup. And I went over to that lathe that you saw in the picture a minute ago, and I made one of these. It was probably this one, considerably skinnier than the present AeroPress, but I was just blown away with how good the coffee tasted because the total wet time was only about a minute. The longer you brew coffee, the more bitter it gets. The interesting thing is to look at the history of coffee brewing. And a century ago, it wasn't uncommon for people to brew coffee by boiling it on the kitchen stove for an hour. When I was a kid, we had a percolator which circulated the same brew again and again and again and yet again through a bed of coffee and made pretty bitter brew. And a really big breakthrough probably occurred approximately in the late 60s, maybe early 70s. The automatic drip machine only passed the water through the bed of coffee one time. And I think that the increment of quality of brew was just remarkably high, going from the percolator to the single pass automatic drip machine. I tried some pretty weird things, like over there on the left is a bicycle pump that was used to pressurize the chamber. It worked, but it was really not necessary. When I had working prototypes, I had the good fortune to meet this guy. Do you all know who he is? This is Kenneth Davids. He gave a talk here today. I bribed him with a bag of macadamia nuts a few minutes ago to autograph my copy of his book, which is the best book on coffee I own. And he did a lot of professional tasting for us, confirmed 175 degrees Fahrenheit as a good temperature to brew. So this is the final product, the AeroPress. That's my granddaughter Constance's hand on top of the press. We like to brew into a sturdy mug with a broad base like this, and it's fun to use a glass mug because you can see the result. So, Scott, where are you? I'd like oh good, Scott is my grandson, and he's going to bring the kettle up here. So I want to actually brew some coffee and talk about it a little bit. This is a really nice kettle. It's a temperature control kettle. We tested about 20 people to see what their favorite temperature was to brew coffee in the AeroPress. 19 of them chose 175 degrees Fahrenheit, and one of them chose 165 degrees. And people are always shocked when we tell them that we brew at that temperature. They say, you can't possibly make coffee at 175. And there are a lot of people out there that are using their AeroPress at 200 or even maybe boiling 212 who have never even tried 175 because they're sure it won't work. But I encourage you to try it. I think you might like it. Incidentally, the one guy who chose 165 is a very, very sophisticated espresso user. He has a $1,500 Pasquini Riviera, a $600 Mazer grinder, and he spends 6 weeks in Italy every spring and drinks espresso straight there every day of those 6 weeks. And he chose 165. So to make an AeroPress, first of all, you put a paper filter in the cap, put the cap on the chamber, put the chamber on a nice sturdy mug, put in anywhere from 1 to 3 scoops of coffee. In our current printed instructions, we suggest fine drip grind, which works well. But I think we'll change the instructions with the next printing to espresso grind. The quality of the coffee you produce either way is equal. But you get a little bit more coffee for your dollar, a little more brew to drink for your dollar, if you use a very fine grind. It's really an economic decision. The flavor can be good either way. However, in order to make an identical cup with, say, drip grind versus espresso grind, you would adjust the espresso grind and use a little bit less coffee, perhaps 10 or 20% less. And it's because the very fine particles expose more of themselves to the water. So I like to give the chamber a little knock just to level the bed of coffee. If the bed of coffee isn't level, occasionally the water will shoot right through into the cup without really brewing. And rather than try to look at the numbers from the outside, I just look in. I pour the water in slowly to the number 2. I have 2 scoops of coffee. And what I do is I count to about 20, which at this speed is about 10-second stir. And this is really when most of the extraction occurs right now. And then if any of you already know me, you know I'm always telling people to press gently. If you press hard, it compacts the bed of coffee and slows the process. And the optimum press is about 15 pounds. I actually brought a scale. If people want to press on the scale and see what 15 pounds feels like, come into that room in the back and try it. Anyway, the weight of my 2 forearms with no muscle applied is 15 pounds. It's not critical. Anything between about 13 and, say, 22 gives about the same result. But you can see the water is slow, or the brew is slowly dripping into the cup. And when all the water is gone, the plunger sinks much more quickly. Now, one of the serendipitous results of the AeroPress invention was totally unplanned for. It's self-cleaning. You take the cap off. We eject it into a travel mug because the pucks end up in our garden. My wife has a very green thumb, and she likes to feed our flowers with coffee grounds. So to finish the cleaning process, you would wipe the coffee grounds off of the seal. The seal is now pressed entirely through the chamber, and if you turn the handle on the plunger, you'll see it rotates easily. And that's the way to store it, because in this condition, it's not in compression. And I believe if you wipe the coffee oil off it and store it this way, it'll last as long as you will, or at least as long as I will. Now, what we pressed right now is concentrate. Depending on the amount of water and how much coffee we started with, it's anywhere from 2 to 4 times stronger than ordinary American coffee. Ordinary American coffee is about 1.25% coffee and the rest water. This concentrate is probably roughly double that, about 2.5%. But if I had used 2 scoops and filled to the number 2, it would have been about 4 times stronger than ordinary coffee, which is the strength of classic espresso. But I've been served espresso that was half that strength, and I've been served espresso that was double that strength. But the classic espresso is designed, as defined in the Italian books on, like there's one called Espresso Coffee by Ely and Viani, is about 5% coffee and about 95% water. Now, if you wanted to dilute this to American coffee, you would add an equal amount of water. If you taste it though, you might find that you like the taste of it as is, because AeroPress coffee has 1/5 the acid level of ordinary drip coffee and 1/9 the acid level of French press coffee. So a lot of people drink it straight. It's a way to get your caffeine medicine in the morning with a little bit less water. If you want to make a latte with this, I would have filled, for a single scoop, I would have filled only to the number on the chamber equaling that 1, which I used 1 scoop. Or if I were making a double latte, I would have used 2 scoops and filled to the number 2. But for American coffee, I put in a little extra water because you're going to be adding water later on anyway. Now you might think, well, why not just put in the whole chamber full of water? And you can. But it won't be as good, and it'll take longer to press through. And the reason is that if you fill the chamber entirely full of water and press all of that water through your puck of coffee, it'll be more bitter and more acid. And I don't think you'll like it as well as if you press just with water to the number 1 or number 2 and then add water. I joked once that there are some people who would prefer to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge than add water to their coffee. But it does make the best tasting cup. With regard to temperature, I often meet people who say, yeah, well, I follow your instructions. I turn off the kettle after it whistles, and I wait a minute before I brew. And I can tell you, for a small kettle like this, you need to wait about 15 or 20 minutes for it to get down to 175. And if you don't have a temperature-controlled kettle, you can get a little dial thermometer like that. And usually you can find a hole in the lid, or you can even drill one yourself. And what I do when I'm using a kettle like this, which is always the case when the electricity goes out in our house, is usually the kettle will start talking a little bit when the water's up around 150 or 160. It'll start to tick, tick, tick. And around that time, I just pay a little bit of attention to it, and I shut it off around 170, and it usually coasts up to about 175. We've had just absolutely fabulous luck with the acceptance of the AeroPress. This was a 2-page photograph in Business Week where they call it the world's greatest single-serve coffee maker. And an interesting thing that we never would have thought of in a million years is AeroPress competitions. There are competitions going now in over 40 countries, and you saw some of that on the CBS video. Brewers compete purely on taste. These are some trophies that we made for the World AeroPress Championship. We've molded AeroPress in gold plastic, silver plastic, and bronze plastic for first, second, and third place. The idea of having competitions was the invention of Tim Wendelboe, who's a well-known coffee expert who owns a cafe in Oslo, Norway. And he held a competition in his cafe in Norway about 6 years ago and called it the World AeroPress Championship. They repeated a year later, and after that they started to move around the world. They've been in London, they've been in Portland, Oregon. Most recently, it was Rimini, Italy, on the 9th of June, which happened to also be the day that the CBS video aired. Now, people sometimes ask me about brewing the inverted way. And with the inverted way, you put the plunger about 1 inch into the chamber and you stand it upside down. You put your coffee and your hot water in and you stir it. And you could steep it forever that way. And that's the way I recommend you brew loose tea in an AeroPress, because if you try it the normal way, the water will run through in a few seconds. But for coffee, generally I feel it leads away from what makes AeroPress coffee taste good, and that is a short wet time, because this process is usually used to extend the wet time. So you put the coffee and the water in upside down, you stir for a while, perhaps steep for a while, put a filter in. It helps to wet it slightly so it doesn't fall out. And then you invert this onto a cup and press. And as I said, I think it leads away from what makes AeroPress coffee taste good. In the United States Championship, about half of the competitors this year in Seattle, about half of the competitors started out inverted, but the top 3 finishers were all the normal way that I demonstrated to you. And in the World Championship in Rimini, Italy, the top 3 finishers all did the normal method too. Now, another variation that people often ask me about is metal filters. You can buy a metal filter the same size as our paper filter. And I made filters like that, or had them made. It's a chemical etch process, and with the chemical etch process, you can make holes in metal that are only 1/1000th of an inch in diameter, which is like 1/12th of what the holes in a typical espresso portabasket are. And the coffee just doesn't taste as good. And I asked Tim Varney once, who runs most of the World AeroPress Championships, which recall are judged purely on taste, if they're allowing metal filters. And he said yes, but no metal filter is ever want to heat. And heat is 3 competitors tasting, and the winner of that heat goes on to a later heat. And perhaps the best reason of all why I don't use a metal filter is that it turns out that coffee that is brewed without a paper filter contains 2 lipids or diterpenes. These are like oils called cafestol and kaweol. And these 2 lipids have been found to be the most potent cholesterol-producing chemicals ever discovered. So people who drink coffee that's made with an espresso machine or a French press or any metal filter have about 10% higher cholesterol than people who drink paper-filtered coffee. And I'm talking about LDL cholesterol, which is the so-called bad cholesterol. And if you Google coffee cholesterol, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's a lot out there to read about. One thing we were kind of curious about was the AeroPress filter is a little bit smaller, and we wondered how it stacked up in removing those 2 lipids from the brew compared to a cone filter, which has obviously a lot more paper in it. And it was exactly the same. Espresso coffee, for example, has roughly 4 milligrams each of cafestol and kaweol, and cone drip or AeroPress drip coffee has 1/10 of a milligram, which is 1/40th of each. I was also curious to know what happened if you reused our filter, because it's real easy to reuse the filter 10 times. I had the lab that was measuring this measure the level of these lipids after each reuse, where the filter was just being rinsed off between uses. And gradually over 10 uses, it went from 1/10 of a milligram to 2/10 of a milligram. So it was 1/40th of unfiltered coffee to start, and if you used your filter 10 times, it would be 1/20th. These are AeroPress basics distilled to the absolute minimum. Put a couple of 1 or 2 scoops of fine ground coffee in your chamber. shake the chamber. You saw me do that. If you're making espresso strength concentrate that you want to use later on as espresso or cook with it, believe it or not, you can make delicious chili with espresso strength concentrate. Or make a latte or cappuccino or even a straight espresso. I would add water to the number on the chamber, which equals the number of scoops of coffee you put in. But for American coffee, I would just add to the number 2. Stir for 10 seconds, press gently. Press gently, press gently. It's my biggest tip, press gently. Then add water for American coffee or milk for a latte. I just cold milk in there and put it in a microwave oven for 45 seconds. I don't fuss with foam because I don't think it's worth the trouble. I've been touting 175 Fahrenheit water. I have found that with very light roasts, like cinnamon roasts, I like it a little bit better with 185 water. I tried going higher than that, but it didn't seem to matter. This is a roast that I made myself. This would be called a full city roast. It's a medium roast. And that's a chunk of milk chocolate in there. So you can see it's about the same darkness as milk chocolate. The beans are not absolutely flat. They have just a little bit of sheen on them. They're not wet. And that's my favorite roast. These are 3 roasts. The one on the left is French roast. The one in the middle is too young to be taken away from its mother. And the one on the right is cinnamon roast. And I find cinnamon roast to be sour, so I prefer the medium roast. And medium roasts, I think, were the favored roasts for most of the country for 50 years or so. This is a VST refractometer that I can measure my coffee with. This is a good way to make foam if you don't have an espresso machine. And this is another instrument as an alternative to the VST I've used. And this is yet another, it's called a optical Brix meter. You can buy these on eBay for about $40 or $50. And they tell you the index of refraction of the coffee, which you can convert to strength. I like a real skinny tip thermometer. This is one. Occasionally I do experiments with a deadweight presser. These are 2 big chunks of brass. This weighs 16 pounds, so if I want to press with exactly 16 pounds, that is exact, unless they change the laws of gravity. So maybe I should take some questions. None at all. I've never cleaned a piston in 6 years, or a chamber. You do get oil residue on the seal, and if you don't clean the seal just with a brush and water, I just brush it off under the tap. If you don't do that, you may get a buildup of goo. It's harmless, but it's very gooey. Yes, I've experimented with cold brew. I think it is not a very interesting flavor to me. It's kind of a flatter flavor. I think most coffee reviewers would say that. It's low in acid, but I don't enjoy the flavor myself. I tried it once and it made such a mess I never tried it again. I'm writing a book about the AeroPress right now, and I wrote, you may be tempted to try brewing with hot milk. Go ahead, but you'll never do it again. The way I did the tests was I would give them 2 cups to drink. Both cups were at about 140 Fahrenheit, which is a preferred flavor for drinking. And I'd say, which one do you like best? And I always started out at 175 and 185. And as I said, 19 out of 20 people chose 175. So then I brewed two more for them, 175 and 165. And 19 out of the 20 people still chose 175, and one guy chose 165. His name is Tom Osborne. He's a fascinating fellow. He's the inventor of the HP 35 calculator. Yes?
At what point did you realize that the AeroPress was going to be a huge success? Was there a turning point? Was it gradual, or was it?
I think it was when I tasted it. And we had spent 20 plus years creating distribution for sporting toys. In our booth upstairs is Alex Tennant brewing coffee for people. He's our general manager. And I invited Alex over to my kitchen and brewed him a cup of AeroPress coffee. And he took a taste and he said, "Alan, I can sell a ton of these." And he knew better than I knew what a hardship we were facing, creating an entirely new distribution system. But I'm really glad we did. It's double the size of our company. No, I've had some requests for a bigger AeroPress, and I've experimented around a little bit, but I don't have one yet that I like a lot. However, I feel that the current size meets about 80% of brewing occasions. That most of the time, people seem to like to brew 1 or 2 servings. You can really stretch it to 4 if you're careful. And I've developed this technique for entertaining where I'll brew up some concentrate before the guests arrive, and then I can serve any number of people very quickly. So I don't feel very much motivation to make a bigger one. For a bigger batch, there's still the automatic drip machine out there, and I probably won't do any iterations. Yes, 2. Oh, they're very common. I don't even remember the name. I don't have the fancy one like Technivorm, for example. I shouldn't really say this because I'll probably be sticking my foot in my mouth, but the Technivorm brews a little bit hotter, and I've been a contributor to Coffee Geek for years, the forum. And on 3 different occasions, I've seen people write in, "I finally bought a Technivorm. I've been wanting one for 10 years. I finally bought one, but my coffee is bitter." And so people start suggesting Guatemala or Yirgacheffe or something like that. And I think to myself, well, of course it's bitter. Your water is hotter. Well, I think we're done, and if any of you want to come to our brewing session, what time is my brewing session? 2:30? 2:15. It's back there and to the right. So thank you very much.